Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Allen Institute. I'm Tom Skalak, the Executive Director of the Paul Allen Frontiers Group. The Frontiers Group is a newly formed group that's part of the Allen Institute with the mission of acting as Paul's external bioscience funding arm, if you will. So our mission is to seek out and support pioneering investigators in biological sciences all over the world and support them as they make new discoveries that advance knowledge and we hope changes the world for the better. Also, in this beautiful building that some of you I think may be visiting for the first time, but some of you are very familiar with already, are our colleagues at the Allen Institute for Brain Science and the Allen Institute for Cell Science. And these two groups work toward understanding the fine structure and detailed functional behaviors of the human brain on the one hand and the cell as the basic unit of living things on the other hand. Today it's our pleasure to host our colleagues from Washington State University and many friends from the very active South Lake Union area and the greater Seattle region in the scientific community, as well as our distinguished speaker to the Allen Institute. We feel that it's a very important role that we can offer to the region by sharing this beautiful building and facility with all of the people engaged in scientific research in the area. I'd like to turn over and now introduce to our Washington State hosts, led by Dr. Chris Keene, who's the Vice President for Research and a Professor of Physics at Washington State University. Since Chris arrived at Washington State University in 2014, he's done a number of significant things to address their research portfolio, but perhaps most notable, he has articulated a series of grand challenges with the faculty at WSU that represent the new institutional priorities for research at that institution that focus on urgent and significant regional, but also national and global problems. And before Chris came to WSU, just a note of his prior experience, he led the user office of the National Ignition Facility, NIF, which you may not know, is the world's most energetic laser, which is impressive. That means in physical terms, not energetic in terms of moving around in space. Both, actually. And that at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, where he had a lot of interactions with our guest speaker today. So please welcome Chris.
Thanks, Tom. Appreciate that. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Tom, for that very nice introduction. As Tom said, I'm the Vice President for Research at WSU. I'd like to start out by thanking Tom and the Allen Foundation for hosting this, and also our colleagues at Washington Research Foundation, UW, and the Hutch, who hosted us this morning and are involved in this visit. So thanks very much for making this all possible. Today's lecture brings together health and computer science researchers and professionals from Seattle and also to explore the intersection of supercomputing and biomedical research. This is really obviously a timely topic, especially here in Seattle and Washington, where we have major hubs for all those activities. I think it's also very relevant to the multidisciplinary research agenda for our universities and for our research institutions broadly here. As Tom mentioned, that's really a major theme. And you'll hear this from Dimitri, cross-disciplinary research to address challenges of major scientific impact. In this case, cancer, marrying advanced computing. So let me just quickly now provide an introduction to Dimitri. It's really an honor to introduce Dimitri as both a colleague and a friend. Dimitri earned his bachelor's degree in physics and pure math, I note it says here, from Berkeley. He then got a PhD in theoretical nuclear physics from Princeton. And after that, he spent time at Michigan State as a postdoc and then served on the Yale faculty. In 2001, Dimitri decided to explore some broader problems of broader impact, and he came to the DOE National Nuclear Security Administration. Some of you may have heard of NNSA, National Nuclear Security, but it's the part of the Department of Energy that is responsible for maintaining the nuclear stockpile as well as the reactor systems on our naval submarines, and also funds non-nuclear proliferation activities at DOE. It's about an $8 billion enterprise. At that enterprise, Dimitri was directly responsible for a program called the Accelerated Strategic Computing Initiative. Some of you may have heard of that program, but you probably surely have heard of the supercomputers at Livermore and Los Alamos, which for many years have led the world, have been very close to the top of the list in capability. Those computing capabilities have been absolutely essential to maintaining the U.S. nuclear deterrent without testing. You know, the U.S. stopped testing in 1992, and since the past 20 years or so, we've been maintaining our nuclear deterrent. It's simply simulating on computer, and when issues arise, testing out solutions on the computer. So simulations are thus critical into that effort, and Dimitri led that program, and so I think the nation actually owes Dimitri a great deal of gratitude for the work that he and his colleagues did. We worked together in kind of an interesting way. Dimitri built advanced computers and the simulation codes that ran on them. My job when we were colleagues at the Energy Department was to build large lasers like Tom described, in which we did experiments to validate those computer programs. So the logic was pretty simple. We built large computers and computer programs, and we tested them with experiments in the laboratory, basic research, actually. So it was a great marriage of simulation and experiment, and again, it successfully certified the U.S. nuclear deterrent every year since 1992. A great model for what you're going to hear today. Dimitri's now involved in applying those capabilities in supercomputing at the DOE laboratories to cancer and the Brain Initiative and other topics. So without further ado, I'll let him tell you about it and introduce Dimitri. So thank you, Dimitri, for coming out.
Thanks. I guess I'm mic'd up. Yep. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Chris. Very nice invitation to come here. It's been certainly a wonderful day so far in terms of what the Allen Institute has, kind of the remarkable science being done here, the Fred Hutch, UW, and we'll see WSU tomorrow, so I'm looking forward to that. But I wanted to tell you a little bit. I'm a physicist, I'm a theorist, so I'm reductionist by nature, and I like to understand why things work, how they work, and I wanted to give you a sense. I've been in government now for 15 years, and it goes really fast, but after a first career in science, I wanted to give you at least kind of a narrative on why we do things, how we do things, and what the opportunities could be as we look forward. And so there's some things that probably don't cross your radar that are important to us. And I wanted to start just kind of giving some context. Presidential initiatives, executive orders, things I was certainly never aware of when I was doing physics. But a couple of them that touch on what we're doing today. One is an executive order that the president signed back in July of last year, creating a national strategic computing initiative, which talks about public-private partnerships. It talks about an all-of-government approach to trying to inject next-generation technology into the missions and to key things important to this country. And so this is kind of a backdrop that I want you just to kind of keep in mind. It's something we've been working with. It also created a new reporting mechanism for computing that reports directly to the president, which is also a nice additional thing. Also last year, the president launched the Precision Medicine Initiative. And just recently, following the State of the Union, the Cancer Moonshot, which is what we're also involved. I have certainly the honor of being part of the vice president's team on leading, unleashing the power of data effort as part of that. And we're in kind of the throes of completing our initial report back to him right now this month. But I want to think about these initiatives because these things don't by themselves do anything. It's a piece of paper, but they are enablers. And if you're aware of them, it allows you top cover to start to think bigger about things. It's an opportunity for partnering that otherwise would be harder to do. And so the threads of this that I find interesting, and which is something we started pushing fairly aggressively over the past year, is trying to understand where the next generation computing is taking us post Moore's Law, how we could attach that to the intersection of these areas. In particular, we ended up looking at precision oncology. And so I just kind of wanted to walk you through. The basis for this are these initiatives, but again, by themselves, they don't provide requirements to do anything. They are simply statements of what we could be thinking about and what are the priorities of the president. And so it takes effort to lean in and figure what you can do in these spaces. The other one relevant here is certainly the BRAIN initiative. I'll get back to this at the very end, but I just wanted to, again, draw a little bit of attention, in particular, a little bit of context in the 7 main areas that the NIH report on BRAIN 2025 outlined, and some of the areas. And again, I'll get back to these in how the Department of Energy thinks about the BRAIN and where the investments we make could, in principle, provide some kind of value to this community. Okay, I want to say a little bit, mostly I'll tell you some stories today, which I hope you'll find interesting, but if not, please let me know. Why do we do computing? Department of Energy is kind of more aptly called Department of Modeling. We're faced with many complex problems you can't instrument, problems you have no way of setting up surrogate experiments to understand, and we have to make decisions, and they are typically things that impact everybody. We're responsible for the nuclear weapons stockpile, for its safety and security. We're responsible for the energy critical infrastructure in this country. We have science responsibilities. We have collections of things where we have to turn to simulation to help inform decisions we have to make. And I'll give you a few examples of what I mean. Often these are decisions that have large costs associated with them. The cost of being wrong can be important. The cost of not doing anything can be significant. And so you have to make a decision. And the question is, how do you draw science into that? How do you understand whether what you think you're simulating or modeling or trying to discern from data is actually true? And with what authority can you say that? We're involved in fielding the world's leading computers. Right now, the National Strategic Computing Initiative asks the Department of Energy, asks us to think about exascale. So we are working on plans for what we consider the next generation in the 2020 timeframe of exascale computing, which are 10 to the 18 floating operations per second type systems. Not as much as an exabyte of data, but a fraction of that, with power envelopes that are manageable, 20 to 30 megawatts. So we're thinking about that at the same time that we see Moore's Law already having run out. And so we're looking very carefully at the problem set, the drives, the architectures, the technologies, the things that we will need to develop in partnership with the tech sector to field the systems that we will need for the missions that we face. Why biology? Most people don't think about us when it comes to the human genome, but life sciences and the confluence of technology and life science has been part of what we think about since the Manhattan Project, where we started to worry about the effects of radiation on cells, on people. And so low-dose radiation and radiation exposure has been a scientific effort for many decades for us. It led us to kind of help spawn the genomic revolution. We had developed dye tagging, lasers, robotics in the 70s. And the convergence of these technologies with genetics became something that we got excited about. And in 1986, we launched the Human Genome Initiative, which after 4 years was joined by the National Institutes of Health, and eventually some years later by Celera to deliver eventually the first sequenced human genome, which was released on the 50th anniversary of the Watson-Crick paper. But it's, again, one of these projects that is kind of characteristic of things we look at, strategic problems, problems that are important to us, problems that have a broader context, things that could launch value for U.S. competitiveness, which generated an ecosystem now built around sequencing and genetics. It was, I think, something which has been transformative, but it's kind of a scale of problem that we think about. And then the last kind of random thought here before I get into into the narrative is what I mean by the end of Moore's law. This is a kind of a well-known slide for computer people, but it effectively shows you the history of processing and what happened, when we ran out of steam in the mid-2000s. Which is when we started to take actions also in our programs. What we noticed is the speed limits for computing hit a maximum, that the amount of power you could dissipate because the chips get too hot, after 140 watts or something, things will start to melt and you just can't cool them, and so you can't run them any faster. And as you hit these different kinds of limits, the only way to keep making things effectively look faster was to just put more processors next to each other and make multi-core processors. The problem is things don't scale in terms of performance with that. And so we're sitting in a space out here where we've really exhausted the benefits of miniaturization. And so we have the opportunity to think about what comes next. We care about this because a lot of the simulations, a lot of the tools we develop take years to mature in terms of how much we trust them, in terms of their efficacy, their verification, the validation against data. And we can't simply change them overnight. They're not throwaway codes. They're millions of lines. They represent kind of our historical understanding of complex problems in the mixture of science and phenomenology that they embody. And so simply changing to a different computer architecture is not a haphazard decision. And so we think very carefully about those. And we're drawn to a place which sits more at the intersection now of machine learning, simulation, and analytics, which we think has great resonance with the biosciences. The kinds of systems we field are fill rooms maybe a couple of times this size. They're typically 10 to 15 megawatt systems. Your megawatt year is roughly $1 million. The machines cost maybe $100 to $200 million. The next systems we're getting next year and the year after, 2017 and 18, are about 200 petaflop systems. And we're going to be delivering a couple of those. And the kinds of problems we run are often over the entire system. So it's not that we run lots of small jobs. We design these so we can run single problems over the entire system. And we have classes of problems where we will use a quarter or so of the machine for a full year, or maybe a year and a half, to run a single time sequence of something that's important for a decision. We don't run it on the whole thing because you need the machine for other things. But in the back of our mind, the question is, are the problems you are trying to solve commensurate with the investment you're making with everybody's tax-paying dollars? So if you have a $200 million machine and you have a $15 million power bill and you have a 4 to 5 year life cycle, and you're going to run a problem for a year on it, you have to ask, is that a $70 million question you are answering? And if it's not, then you should find something else to look at. And so we balance the investments against the problems we're trying to solve. and we think about the architectures in terms of the best way to approach those problems, but in a way that will lead to long windows of sustainable designs. So we went in the early 2000s, we pushed into, with our Blue Gene series, into computers that had 100,000 or more processors. And we started running in early 2000s on 100,000, 130,000 processors, which people thought was lunacy before we started doing it. Not long after that, we were running on 2 million processors. When we think about exascale, we're thinking about billions and concurrency, which is maybe 1,000-fold. And it is a complicated architecture, but it's an interesting space. And with the pace of technology moving, what it means to you, why you should care is, you know, when we did our first 10,000 processor system back in '96 at Sandia, it looked like this, the size of a basketball court, half a megawatt. You know, about 15 years later, maybe more or less, 1 teraflop fits on a chip, and it'll be the same thing. As we think about exascale, what it means to you is if we can reach the 20 to 30 megawatt window for that, you'll have a 1 watt, 1 teraflop wearable item you could put on a pin or a patch or something. You'll have a 100 teraflop system you can plug into a wall socket. It'll be the energy of a hairdryer, 1.5 kilowatts. So, you could imagine what that means with the ubiquity of computing, the cheapness, and its functionality. And it could really be everywhere in ways that we can't even imagine now. And so thinking carefully about the applications and where it could go is an interesting place. So when I think about computing, it's different than how I thought about it as a scientist. As a physicist, when you think about what you do with a big computer, you start with the problem that you're a domain expert on. You understand the degrees of freedom typically. You know what you're trying to solve. So you start with a model, you understand it's in a phase space or it's in a Hilbert space. You understand relevant degrees of freedom. You know what you're trying to measure. So you have an observable. Maybe it's the free energy of something. Maybe it's some other kind of stress or some other property, but you have an observable, and you spend all your time working on the algorithms to discretize and to solve it and get your problem done. And that's kind of, you're the master of the domain, and you understand this, and it's the approximation. The problems are well defined. The problems that we care about are separate class. These are problems that are likely ill-posed. They come from different places. They come because they're important questions. We don't know what the underlying theory is. In principle, there might not be any. We don't know how to state the question technically. Often there's no observable. We don't know what to measure. And so there is no real starting point. And often we have to answer these things fast. And so the question is, how do you attack those classes of problems? And so I thought I'd tell you, some of them, which I hope you might find interesting. The reason we end up in this space are the kinds of questions we encounter. And I'll talk about the ones that I've been involved with in my years at DOE, just to kind of give you a sense of how these came about, again, from my point of view. The questions we get when something happens is, what do we do? Okay, and the question is, should science inform any of these in the first place? And that's really a separate kind of question. If you understand, if you can predict something, what's your confidence in anything that you're saying in terms of people depending on what you're telling them? Understanding at what point we can draw on science. When something happens, people want to know, well, what's it mean? What are the risks? What has happened? Is it going to happen again? And we don't always get the right questions, but nevertheless, those are the questions. We don't always get the right people asking, whatever that might mean. And it's not even clear we're always positioned to answer them. But nevertheless, roughly once a year, we'll end up drawn into these. And the reason goes back to what Chris mentioned. I like to start with kind of this picture of Mars and Ceres. They're not all pictures because one of those is an artist rendition of the Mars rover. I like to show this because what I like in the picture is what you miss in one of these. Whoops, is I guess I'll use this. Is the access road and the observation deck here. The road over here, you can see the access road here. You know, this is why we're in this business. This is probably one of the more fascinating of our sites, the Nevada test site, which is about the size of Rhode Island. It's 1,400 square miles. It's about 90 minutes north of Las Vegas. It's a very interesting place to visit if you get the occasion, but it's kind of the legacy of where we came from as a nation. As Chris said, we stopped testing nuclear weapons in 1992, but nevertheless, as we stopped manufacturing them, as we stopped building them, we still have them. We still have thousands of them. They are old, they're aging, decades old, some beyond what their expected lifetimes are. They sit in bunkers, they go through thermal cycling. You have 18 to 20-year-olds that move them around. We drive them around the country. We've driven them, you probably passed them on the highway and didn't know. We've driven 100 million miles in driving these. We drive them from our plant in Texas that takes them apart and puts them back together to different military sites, so we deliver them for their deployment. So we care quite a bit about them and what it means if a truck gets into an accident, if these things go old. When we open them up, it's not like the Peacemaker movie with Clooney and Kidman, where you can take your pocket knife and you can bang on it and render it relatively safe. It's a complex process. We pull a number of them apart in Amarillo, Texas at our Pantech site every year. We look inside, decades old, and then you see corrosion. You see stuff that's cracked because near this radioactive material you have electronics, you have high explosives, and over decades of thermal cycling, this thing has gotten old. And then the question is, well, what does it mean? And you can't test it. Okay, but people will be handling this and moving it around. Is it safe? And can you guarantee to the president that it'll work if needed? And what does that mean? What is the guarantee you provide? We have a process every year. We report to the president in March whether we need to go back to underground nuclear testing. Again, the scars of our history are out there in the Nevada plains. And the science we did there was not science in terms of what you're probably doing in this building, not science in what you might be doing at the LHC. There's this real cheesy music I like just because it kind of dates the piece. But nevertheless, we did 1,054 nuclear tests of 1,149 devices in our history. Our banner year was about 98 tests, which is once almost every 3 days. This was the nuclear cannon, the 280 millimeter cannon in the Grable shot. And the instrumentation here you'll see are a bunch of rockets that they send up that they measure prompt particles coming out. But there are very few things you can instrument. And the kinds of things we want to understand today were hard to instrument from these kinds of tests, which were more proof of principle. Now we're trying to understand if you have an aged material sitting in there, does it affect performance in some way? Does it affect safety or security? And how do you answer that, and with what confidence? And the legacy, of what we did before just is not adequate to understand the microscopic non-equilibrium physics and chemical processes that are important to this. We have a process every year. It's like painting the Golden Gate Bridge. Once you get to one side and deliver to the president, you start right away on the other side and you go through all of our weapons system, through all of our devices to try and understand whether we have any issues for the next cycle. But these days, these tools are used broadly. We use them to understand how we think about North Korea, what's going on there, foreign countries and their activities. They're tools that have developed a pedigree of trust in which we have designed ways to quantify uncertainties and instill a rigor for things that are multi-scale, multi-time scale, multi-length scale. You know, physics happens down at the Fermi scale in the fission process and the fusion process. We care about the effects out to, you know, sometimes kilometers. And so the distance from 10 to the minus 15 meter to 10 to the 3 is kind of the length scale that we care about. The time scales are equally daunting. And we have to run things across those scales because it's important to include the physics and chemistry in a non-equilibrium system to manage that and come out eventually with statements that what you see is not problematic. Because of that, we have a robust set of tools, and we've been called upon in many cases to attack problems that have become time urgent for different kinds of reasons. So let me go through just give you a flavor of some of the things in a kind of a random capture of some of these. I remember the day, February 1st, 2003, because I was sitting at the San Diego airport, leaving on a Saturday morning from a meeting there. And we were sitting around, you know, there's the bar section in the middle with the TV screens and the gates behind. And I knew the space shuttle was coming in on re-entry above. And so there was kind of that moment where I stared at the TV screens, and what I saw were those parallel trails coming in. And you know, it didn't make any sense because I knew there should just be one. And I didn't understand what I was seeing. And it was one of those moments that, you know, it just kind of etched in that something bad is happening. And it was almost directly overhead. At that time. The following Monday, we were in touch with NASA, and we started to ask what we could do to help. And in fact, so I have just kind of two slides I'll show you. NASA had seen that something had happened. You know, at 81 seconds into the flight, they had already determined, and this is kind of a high-resolution reconstruction they did, they saw several pieces of foam coming out and striking it. And so it's not that they didn't know something happened. They observed this. And if you ever see this foam, it's about 1 pound per cubic foot. It feels almost like nothing. But at this speed it was going, because of the air drag and the distance it went, the relative speed to the shuttle on impact was about 700 feet per second. NASA had a code at that time called Crater. And you can read about this in the Gaiman Commission report. Crater was kind of their code that had been built by their scientists. It was believed to be a conservative tool. And I like this example because it was a belief. It wasn't mathematically rigorous, but they thought it was conservative. It had been developed for the Apollo program to understand micrometeoroids and the impact on re-entry. And they had adapted it to the space shuttle. And they had determined that there was no problem, that this was not an issue. We started to look at this because we have codes, because we have thermomechanical codes, because we have the big computers. We have codes for continuum to non-continuum transitions as you enter the outer atmosphere into the atmosphere. And we can try and understand from a systems point of view. But also we certainly appreciate aging because we look at the aging stockpile. And this curve is a bit just of you know, eye candy, if you will. It's what's important is that there are two different lines here. This was the 28th re-entry of the space shuttle. 41 of the 44 tiles on it were original of the front end wing sections, these reinforced carbon-carbon wing edges. That are here shown in blue. We managed to get a piece that was 19 re-entries old, and what happens is the strength degrades. And so the peak stress it takes to cause catastrophic failure changes. We were able to do materials characterization of stress and strain as a function of age. We were able to predict by March that the likely scenario for this was, in fact, the foam hitting the front of the reinforced carbon-carbon, I guess it is running. The peak stress for aged material is about 6,300 psi For pristine material, it's about 8,000 psi. And so what we saw for the relative velocities, we had predicted that this would fail. And by March, we reported out from simulations in the material characterization that we believed the fundamental mode for failure was this, in which hot gases then rush in, you heat to 5,000 degrees, and you melt the inside. That didn't actually get any news. Why I like this example is because a lot of people tend to believe only when they see things, and it has to be an experiment. And it wasn't until July, I happened to be watching TV, and they showed that they had finally figured it out. And it was experiments done at the Southwestern Research Institute, wherever they had done these experiments finally and shot foam tiles into kind of a reconstructed wing edge. And they, in fact, validated what we predicted. Having known this sooner wouldn't have made too much difference because there isn't much you could do, but at least it shows that bad codes can lead you astray. And you have to be careful about what you're trying to predict and what the limitations are in terms of what you think you can do. This one I like because it stressed our sense of uncertainty quantification. This was a case, we launched a satellite in 2006 from Vandenberg, which failed as it entered orbit, and it was kind of in a slow tumble. And in 2008, it was coming back in. We knew it was going to re-enter in an uncontrolled way. It had a giant hydrazine tank, N2H4, which is toxic. And we were asked to help and figure out, could this thing be taken down? And remember, shortly before that, the Chinese had a weather satellite at about 537 miles of altitude that they had destroyed, and it's left 2,000 pieces of debris that are still in orbit, golf ball size and bigger, that the Air Force still tracks, that took out a Russian nanosat, I think, back in 2011, and has come close to the International Space Station. So how you take something out of orbit is not trivial. We put a team together. We dedicated one of our supercomputers specifically just to this task. The team put together a pretty cheesy video. But the problem about re-entry is the following. The atmospheric thickness is uneven. It depends upon atmospheric conditions. It's like a rock skipping on a lake. When you throw it, it skips, and then eventually it digs in and goes down. And same thing with re-entry. In a 10-day window, you'd know plus or minus 1 day when it was going to come down. So the question was, with what confidence could you predict the conditions and how you take this out? And it was a decision that went up to the president, President Bush at the time, to make. We came back with about 85% or 80% confidence that we thought this would work, and the answer was no. That's not enough. And we worked on it some more. There were a few degrees of freedom that were at our control. And ultimately, we came back with a solution that we thought was 95% confidence that this could be shot down at a low enough altitude so that the debris does not stay in orbit, and at a high enough altitude so that it's not going too fast. It's coming in at 30,000 kilometers per second, and you're trying to shoot that out of the sky with a missile. And so we thought about 150 to 200 miles was the range. And we had predicted the telemetry. The ship went out of Pearl Harbor, steamed down to the middle of the Pacific. I think it was the Lake Erie. And they took the shot, and it worked. It compared to the telemetry we predicted. Certainly, Washington was on the phone with the commander. The commander, incidentally, works now in human capital at NNSA. But the problem is this satellite was coming in. It's like a Coke can with a spherical tank and then 4 panels. If you hit the Coke can part with the missile, it's just like a bullet through paper. Nothing would happen. So you really had to hit dead center in the hydrazine tank. Anyway, the telemetry compared the signatures. It was a successful shot. Weather 95% confidence was actually right, we'll never know. Because, I mean, that's one of the problems. These are unique things, one of a kind. You take your best tools. You have no starting point. You don't have models for this. You're not sure exactly what you're measuring. We got involved with Fukushima because we own the nuclear emergency response missions for, when they send in teams because of nuclear devices or any kind of nuclear problem, we're the ones who have to go out. So we worry about this. We have teams that are always ready. We have a team out in Nevada at Nellis that works that. And so we were naturally drawn in to monitoring what was going on and working with the Japanese on this. I don't need to go through the whole Fukushima narrative. I know you likely are aware of that. There's a particular aspect because of the kinds of questions and where we were drawn into simulation. There were questions that came up right away. In fact, it was 11 p.m. one night, which was midday in Tokyo, where the question came up, do we need to evacuate U.S. personnel? Well, why? Well, at that time, there were about 580,000 U.S. Visitors to Japan per year. In that year, there were 5,000 to 6,000 student visas. So in that time window, there were about 90,000 citizens there. And the question is, well, how do we think about that? And the questions that came out were, what could happen? Can you evacuate people? And you shouldn't think, okay, let's be conservative, let's evacuate people. If you've been to Narita Airport and you have to, if you want to evacuate, you own the logistics. Okay, so how do you do that? How do you get 100,000 people to Narita and out of Japan? It's not a simple thing to say, let's evacuate people. And so we were called at 11 p.m., and we had to have something in about an hour, best estimate, to inform the decision that was happening at the White House that evening on what to do. And the questions were fairly basic. What happened? Could it reach Tokyo? With what isotopes? What could happen? What does it mean? And you don't have initial conditions. We have some atmospheric models. We have at least some ways of discerning things. But we were suddenly pressed with a number of questions which were important, which were time urgent, which you needed some simulations to model, which you had to demonstrate at least with what certainty you could predict anything, and a decision was going to be made whether you did it or not. And so we got dragged into this at this point, and we did the monitoring for radioisotopes and the sampling and handed that back to the Japanese in mid to late May of that year. So for several months, we were deeply involved with this thing. But what was interesting was the quality of the problem and the uncertainty we had, the time urgency, the time of day, and the need. Just to pick another random example, the Christmas Day bomber, which happened December 25th. It was the flight from Amsterdam to Detroit, where Abu Muttalib was wearing a PETN explosive, I believe, in his underwear. And the reason we got involved with this was, again, a little bit random. How does science get drawn into this? How do you lean into these problems? Well, it turned out the week before, on the 18th of December, we had Janet Napolitano, who was Secretary of Homeland Security, stopped by to see Secretary Chu, who was Secretary of Energy. She came in, I was in there with the two of them, and here's my Nobel Prize, what do you think? And they had a nice conversation. But there was a key point of the discussion which made a difference when Secretary Chu told her, I want you to think of my laboratories as your laboratories. I'm there to help you. And 1 week later, when this happened and she was quoted, she mentioned, I think she was in New York at the time, that we were going to work together to figure this out. What that meant is between Christmas Day and New Year's Day, the White House asked us for a program plan on aviation security, on what we would do. Not the best time for getting lots of people to craft a program, but nevertheless, that's what you do. And we put something together, by the way, the 3.5 fluid ounce, the restrictions at the airport, that's our fault. That's something we did years before that, but that's our lab product. We started looking at what it takes to take down planes. How do you think about luggage? How do you think about tearing of airframes? And there's a lot of stored elastic energy in the airframes. And what it leads to is ductile tearing of the aluminum skin in a lot of the older planes that aren't necessarily composite. And it's really a rush of timescales. Can you decompress faster than you get structural failure? The ripping rate of a kind of standard aluminum there is, I think, a meter per 10 milliseconds. And once you cross a couple of aluminum ribs, you can cause catastrophic failure. So if you took a 737, for example, a 737-700 with 68 windows, and you blew out all the windows, it's about 6 square meters of area. And if you depressurize the plane, it takes you maybe 90 to 190 milliseconds to fully decompress. And the problem is catastrophic failure can happen in 10 or 20 milliseconds. And the question is then, what do you do? And so we crafted a program, and we actually worked for about a year on and found a number of interesting results that have led to some things, but I can't say more other than we ended up at that time between Christmas and New Year's with, craft a plan to answer these questions that is scientifically based. Okay, and what's the starting point? We don't have the model of an airplane because first, this is all proprietary. And so we have to do best guess, run it past companies like Boeing and Airbus and say, hey, is our model reasonable? And the answer is, well, it looks close, but they won't tell us exactly what they use. But we have the ability to do destructive testing and different kinds of things. Okay, I would talk about Ebola, but I need to get to some of the why I was bringing this up. Big data. Let me come back to this because I tend to talk a little bit too much about these stories. When we look now at opportunities, when we think about the kinds of problems that we are addressing that come up, the tools the country needs to have to be ready, the workforce, the next generation of whatever it is, we've started to look into the life sciences more heavily, certainly motivated by the Precision Medicine Initiative, motivated by the Moonshot, motivated in part by the Brain Initiative, to ask, how do we think about what we're developing if we step back from just the mission things that we're trying to do, and we think about the architectures and the convergence of more cognitive simulation with a lot of data footprint and analytics functionality? What could you do in that space, and what would you build, and how do you design that? And we have kind of a 4 billion synapse neuromorphic component we're plugging into one of our nodes right now in our systems to try and explore, at least with pinging neurons, what that means. But we think that there is something very interesting, and we've been talking to partners, people who are willing to lean forward with us. It's nothing that's exclusive, but some of the partners that we have in trying to figure out if there is a there touch many different dimensions. We started to talk to the National Cancer Institute, the VA more recently, just at the beginning of this year, countries like Norway, Pharma, GlaxoSmithKline, IBM, Intel, GE, in terms of whether they want to walk this path with us and take some of this risk. The problems we typically face are hard. We don't know if they're solvable. We don't know if they're well posed. But we typically know we need an answer. We need progress there, and it's worth trying to work strategically to try and solve these. This is just, we created a very fancy document that we had our Secretary of Energy and the Secretary of VA sign in front of the Vice President back in the middle of June, and then that the Vice President announced at his Moonshot Summit on the 29th of June. But what are we thinking? With the VA, they have this remarkably rich, perhaps the world's richest data set. They would love to have somewhere with tools, with next generation tools, with access, with a research base accessing it and doing something to impact veterans' health. Not to write papers, but to really impact directly the veterans. And so this is what we're starting to do. DOE also has a number of networks. We have an internet backbone that we use because the science missions drive us to require a lot of bandwidth. So it's a 100 gigabit network right now, but we're talking about upgrading another factor of 10. We're connecting the VA sites to our backbone, which touches all of our labs and also goes internationally. And creating an image in an enclave that would then store their data and create a first instance of it to be used where we can start developing tools with the next generation of systems in mind. And so we're just in the process right now in the next few months of doing SneakerNet down to the Oak Ridge site, which is where we're going to have the first image. So this is, again, all this stuff is formative. We don't have all the data yet. And we're creating, before the end of this year, we need a 5-year program plan. Last Friday, we hosted a parliamentary visit from the government of Norway to one of our laboratories in Livermore, in this case. And we're getting a fair amount of their data. And we have some programs we're trying to set up now with their database to address cervical and breast cancer. And so our initial data dump is about 10 million individual records. But we had the vice presidents announce this yesterday in New York. So we're starting down this path. The first thing, we certainly need data. We need partners. We need tools. We started with Doug Lowy, going back to the National Cancer Institute, to create also a joint long-term program where we have partnered directors of the National Cancer Institute, subdirectories, with our laboratories, Argonne, Oak Ridge, Livermore, and Los Alamos at the moment, on 3 different categories of problems. We are going to be looking at a very hard and intractable, well-known problem, RAS, or rat sarcoma, looking at the molecular level for pathways, thinking about the next generation of systems and what exaflops could bring to this class of problem. We have one level which is at the far end, population base, with Pemberthy and the SEER registry and the cancer databases. We are starting to look at that data with the tools jointly. And in the middle, we have the PDX, patient-derived xenograft, the cell lines, experiments that are going to be done by the National Cancer Institute, but tuned to the simulations and modeling we like to do. All of these are tied to the architectures we're trying to develop. They're tied to the systems we're delivering, computer systems, in 2017 and 18. They're tied to injecting machine learning and analytics into simulation, and they are closely tied all to each other. And so we've started working this. This will come out also in the Vice President's report. But we're actually pretty excited about this. We've asked companies whether they want to join us. And again, we've got interest from Glaxo. GSK is leaning forward into this and recognizes that their company is not, well, that pharma in general is not well suited to precision medicine and its vision of meeting your needs or your needs. In that drug discovery is not tailored to individuals. And they want to help create an aggressive program of getting from molecule to first in human in less than 12 months. Okay, this is something they believe needs to happen for them to be transformative and align with precision medicine. and they're willing to commit resources to doing things like that. For us, we think of this as one of the tools that can help us. The pull from missions drives the technology to meet a need rather than just creating the technology in a vacuum. We're partnered with other companies, and we're talking with companies like GE, who are developing instrumentation, and they would love to develop things that could be tailored to the needs that emerge in the kinds of pilot efforts we're doing. I should mention, because again, we're at Paul Allen Brain Institute, there's nothing I could tell you here about brain that you wouldn't know. If I wanted to know something about brain, this is where I come. So my goal here is to say how we're thinking about brain and why should we care. DOE builds user facilities. We have nanofabs, so we have centers for integrated nanotechnologies. We build very small sensors. We build small detectors. We stream multiple channels of multimode data. We stream them for complex experiments, for open science to national security. We have a complex set of things. We have molecular foundries. We care about genetics and modifying plants for biofuels. We care about sequencing in a broad context. It touches a lot of our missions. And as we think about this, the question that came up largely due to Francis Collins's poking at us was, is there some partnership that Department of Energy could do with NIH or with others when we think about user facilities of tools, of functionality, of capabilities? Big science is expensive. Facilities cost billions. They cost a lot more to maintain. Should we be thinking about imaging? Should we be thinking about technology that would be aligned with projects that are beyond the reach of individual PIs, that we know would not come naturally out of lab bench science, but would require a pretty strong pull from specialists? And so, we're thinking in these domains of areas that could be potentially valuable, but brain for us is not one of our missions, and necessarily it would have to come through partnerships with a sector that has an identified demand that would make sense for us to step into this. We've done things like that. The artificial retina is always a nice plug. It's something that has been fairly invisible in our department, but nevertheless, it was a project that we did. Kind of in another example, not at the scale of the Human Genome Project, of course, but something at the scale that required manufacturing. It required sensors, detectors, knowledge, physiology, materials that would work well in the body. These days, we think of additive manufacturing and the kinds of things we're trying to do there for our missions, but which could be relevant to this space. The artificial retina took a number of laboratories and schools, extended period of time to develop, but it's now FDA approved and it's licensed out, and it's been interestingly impactful. Question is, in brain, how do we think about that? We've had a couple of workshops on that, but it's been fairly slow, and so part of the goal out here is to understand what your questions are, what your issues are, and is there a place that we should be thinking about science that would make sense to both us and you. Anyway, I kind of talked about this. I think I've exceeded my limit as always. Apologies for that. So what do you make of all of this? Well, I hope I've given you a little bit of a narrative of how our town works, kinds of things that provide top cover for doing things that are big, beyond kind of your comfort zone, beyond your bounds. Presidential initiatives are these kinds of things. It's not something you would wait for someone to contact you about. Typically, they provide top cover to reach out and try and make something happen. So it's a good organizing principle if you self-identify as being willing to do something. We have a track record for thinking of big problems, but really all of this requires partners to go out and do things together. Ultimately, the country being responsive to issues as they emerge will require us to to develop this next generation of system, and we do really think that the problems in the life sciences are the right kind of sector pull that will drive the next generation of architectures that will be broadly applicable to all of the missions that we care in energy, in national security, in science, and overall in competitiveness. So I think it's a great moment in time. We're looking for people to talk to. We're looking for ideas. It's been a wonderful day, and I thank you for all of your time.
Okay, Dimitri, well, thank you for a very interesting talk. So we have time for a few questions, and then we'll have the rest of the questions out at the wine reception. So go ahead.
How do changes in administration, such as what we're about to face?
Please grab the mic. Thanks.
Yeah, how will changes in presidential administrations affect these initiatives?
So there are different answers to that. So the executive orders will expire, but among career people who are thinking about these things, and the extent that we start to self-organize to attack big problems, these things can last. So there are moments in time in which you can get the vice president or the president to get people in a room and say, we need you to step up and help do this. But after that, it's up to those who are working it to run with it, and that can happen below the political level. And so you look for these executive orders to see, is this the right kind of forcing function to create the kind of change you need to develop something different? And to the extent you can get something going there, then they'll survive on their own merits.
Okay, right there.
We had one up here first.
So I wanted to ask a similar question with regards to not just big projects, but biology or medicine with regards to the bigger project. So where do you see that going within the next 10 years? And being part of the Allen Institute, it's taking us a really long time where we had to really work hard on defining these bigger questions and how to go about them. And what do you see DOE handling such questions, and whether that can easily be applied to biology or medicine?
So the big questions, and they're linked to bio, already exist for us in terms of biofuels, for example, not exclusively, but in terms of our energy mission space, we care quite a bit about the life sciences. There is, and also the radiation program is an enduring need for us, and so we care about this, and so there will always be a need to push these limits. The question is at what scale and with whom. And I think the opportunity that open up from time to time, like with the Moonshot and precision medicine and brain, is that it opens a door for others to partner and creates opportunities that might not normally exist in normal agency planning of its missions, which can often be more narrowly focused, especially for mission agencies that are delivering things. You have kind of standard performers and you go there to get things done. Again, there are moments in time when you have a bit of luxury to step back and think more broadly of, what could we really do if we rallied people together? Is there something more dramatic that could happen? The biosciences, I think, are going to be the pull for this next decade, in terms of innovation, of technology, because it touches everybody. It's kind of the unique thing that everyone cares about. And so I think as we develop the next generation of smarter components, the wearables that are teraflop wearables that are smart, the 100 teraflop that you stick under ICU beds or attached to cell towers or put in your basement or wherever you want them, and the communication fabric from IoT, as it touches, the life science-related componentry. I think that's going to be an ecosystem that will explode, and there will be a dramatic pull there that will touch biological sciences, and I think that's the one that is especially fascinating. And being at kind of the forefront of that right now is an interesting time.
You mentioned about neuromorphic computation or something like that, I guess. So, is there any way that sort of computation complement the complexity that is used to solve some problems such as cancer or some sort?
Yeah, so I think so, and that's, again, we look at problems that are a little bit beyond market, where you can't just build something trivially. So there is a richness in data, and so what we like is this notion of prediction, because a lot of things we have to make decisions for things that are typically dynamic. There's a dynamics involved, and increasingly there is a richness of data. To test the trust you have in predictions you make, the direction, the vision we have is making the validation component, the validation comparing to experiment, to data, to the richness of data, done in real time in your simulation. So, we'll do a $50 million experiment in Nevada where we'll have thousands of channels of data that will be streamed over a huge amount of time, and we'll do other types of complex tests that will have dynamic information. And the question is, how do you take all of this data and compare it to a simulation that dumps petabytes of data? How do you validate anything in these complex multi-scale problems? And what would be nice to do, and what one of the drivers is, what if we could embed all of this data in its time, multi-scale, in the simulation itself, and through machine learning methods, whether it's pinging neurons or GPUs, or pick your approach, try and validate in real time at different length scales in your simulation, and fundamentally redefine what simulation is going to be in the next decade. I think that's the place that things are going to go. Something that can simulate, make a prediction, and do the analytics and validation at the same time. And now you think of a richness of a time sequence of images, or many different levels of images, and what you can extract, and perhaps you have a model for something that happens in that space that you'd like to run and do your best comparison of a dynamical process against these images. Well, how do you do it? It's not it's too much information for a person to do, but can you create the system, the architecture that would do something like this for you? That's an area we don't see any mission pull from anyone. There are a lot of places doing machine learning. Down the street, you go to Amazon, of course, they care about it. Google cares about it. People care about it. AI being driven for autonomous vehicles. There are a lot of people doing pockets of this very focused, very leading edge work. We're interested in the intersection of where high performance computing is going, the fundamental design of the next generation of architectures, and how we do all of this together. And that we don't see anyone else doing, or we just buy it, which would make life much simpler. But I think that's kind of, with all the richness of imagery that's coming, and imagine the diagnostics that will be here in 5 years' time, how much more dynamic information you might be able to get. What do you do with all that, and how do you prepare for that? And so that's why we're thinking about taking this step change in technology and working at the same time to develop the tools with the National Cancer Institute and their specialists, because it's a well-defined problem. They have a mission pull that they care about, and it might pull us along to try and figure out whether this makes any sense. Like any of these problems, we don't know if there's an answer. That's why we do these things.
Okay, I think, Dimitri, one more question from Tom.
Dimitri, it was very impressive to hear you talk about how you're going in a big way after big population data sets with the veterans 1 million plus veterans in your MVP program, and then the Norway collaboration. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit, whether you're looking at other major data sample sets, because I think in today's precision medicine revolution, access to samples is gold, if you will. So I think that's a very smart approach. But B, could you talk about whether you're going to be going after population sets that maybe do not have cancer, sort of like the strong space shuttle tile, the healthy one, because that might be important to understand the whole story.
I think in the big picture for this last point, you're exactly right. The health trajectories are certainly a kind of an ultimate goal. It's not clear how out of reach they are, but there are certainly components of what we're thinking about that align with that, kind of in the back of our mind. So yes, we've taken on a few challenges right now with the VA. The VA isn't just prostate cancer is the main cancer intersection with VA, but it's also schizophrenia and heart. So they care about or cardiovascular. So the 3 areas we're doing with the VA will touch those initially, but as we move it along, it could change. It depends on what their priorities are. It's for them to set. Data is gold. Treating it with the right respect is always key. More data isn't always better unless it's curated in some appropriate way. So, managing to do something positive with what we have right now is already ambitious. So if we can make progress, I assume it's something that will be scalable and much bigger. But we have a lot to do to demonstrate that we're doing anything useful, and time will tell.
Okay, well, Dimitri, thank you. So the discussion will now continue out in the lobby with the reception. So let's thank our speaker again. Dimitri, thanks for coming out.